She invited me in, but the moment I crossed the threshold, her daughter's nanny closed the door, and my world quietly shifted. The rain had been falling in soft, steady sheets all evening, blurring the streetlights and leaving the pavements glistening like scattered glass. I was walking home, hands shoved deep into my jacket pockets, when a quiet, ivy-covered house caught my eye. There was something almost magnetic about it, soft golden lights spilling from the tall windows, the gentle sway of curtains in the breeze, and the faint echo of piano music drifting into the street. Curiosity drew me closer. I noticed a woman standing at the doorway, her silhouette framed by the warm glow inside. She was older than me, maybe in her early 40s, and yet there was a graceful elegance in her posture, a quiet strength in the way she held herself. She didn't look stern or unapproachable. There was a softness in her eyes, a trace of melancholy that made her seem achingly human. When she noticed me, she offered a small, almost hesitant smile, and for reasons I couldn't quite explain, it felt like an invitation I couldn't refuse. "Come in," she said, her voice calm and welcoming, carrying just the slightest hint of warmth that made my chest tighten. It wasn't a casual gesture. There was something deliberate in the way she opened the door, as if she'd been expecting someone like me, though I'd never met her before. I stepped inside, and the world outside seemed to vanish. The scent of fresh tea and polished wood wrapped around me like a soft blanket. The piano music continued, distant yet comforting, filling the room with a quiet intimacy. I noticed the subtle details, the curve of her vase of lilies, the neat stack of books on the side table, the way light pooled on the floor in a golden rectangle. Everything about the room felt personal, lived in, yet untouched by chaos. When she gestured toward a chair, her hand brushed mine lightly, brief but electric. It lingered just a fraction longer than politeness required, enough that I could feel the warmth of her skin, the quiet steadiness of her pulse beneath the surface. I swallowed, feeling a strange mix of excitement and hesitation. There was an unspoken question in her eyes, a gentle curiosity mirrored in my own. I realized then that the evening had shifted entirely. What began as a chance encounter in the rain had become a private, almost sacred space, shared between two strangers on the brink of something unspoken. There was no rush, no pressure, just the faint hum of life and music and possibility. And yet, as I was about to speak, the door clicked behind me. I turned slightly, and a younger woman appeared in the frame, calm, composed, and unmistakably vigilant. She smiled, but there was a firmness in the way she held the door, a subtle barrier that immediately reminded me that this world I'd stepped into had its own rules, its own guardians. In that moment, I realized that whatever this connection was, it wouldn't be easy, and somehow, that made it all the more compelling. This expanded version, I had just taken a cautious step into the sitting room, the warmth of the house wrapping around me like a soft, reassuring blanket. The widow smiled at me, that quiet, almost shy curve of her lips, and I felt the subtle pull of familiarity, even though we had only just met. For a heartbeat, it felt like I could finally cross the threshold into her world, step closer to the quiet intimacy that seemed to hang between us. And then the door clicked. I turned, startled, to see a younger woman standing there, firmly blocking the entryway. She was in her early 30s, composed, with an air of gentle authority that immediately demanded respect. Her eyes were sharp, attentive, but not unkind. She carried herself like someone used to protecting something precious, and suddenly, the warmth of the house felt partially cordoned off, filtered through her careful presence. "Sorry," she said softly, though her voice held a quiet firmness. "She's not usually ready for visitors." I felt a mix of frustration and hesitation. The widow's face, usually so composed, flickered with a trace of apology and something more, a hint of longing, perhaps, or regret. She didn't protest. Instead, she gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, silently acknowledging my presence while respecting the invisible boundary that the nanny represented. The young woman's hand rested lightly on the doorframe, positioning herself just enough to close the room off without seeming hostile. I noticed the subtle details, the faint scent of lavender in her hair, the soft rustle of her blouse as she shifted weight from one foot to the other, the careful, almost protective tilt of her head. Everything about her presence reminded me that this wasn't just a home. It was a carefully curated world, one that I hadn't yet earned the right to enter fully. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The widow's eyes met mine across the space, warm and apologetic. I felt the tension coil inside me, a mix of curiosity, frustration, and something deeper, a pull toward her that I couldn't quite name yet. It was strange, subtle, and electric, like stepping on the edge of something forbidden yet tantalizing. I understand, I said finally, my voice steady despite the quickened beat of my heart. I offered a polite nod to the nanny, who returned it with a careful, measured glance. There was no animosity, only the quiet assertion of boundaries. Even as I felt a twinge of disappointment, I realized something important. The moment the door closed, it wasn't just an obstacle. It was a sign that this connection mattered. The stakes were real, and the slow burn of curiosity and attraction had just become infinitely more intense. I wasn't just drawn to her. I was drawn into her life, into the protective layers that made her world both enchanting and inaccessible. As I stepped back into the hallway, the sound of the rain outside seemed louder, echoing my own pulse. The widow's gaze lingered on me a fraction longer, and I understood without words. This was only the beginning. Days passed, yet I couldn't shake the image of that warm, golden-lit house, or the quiet elegance of the widow who had invited me in. Each evening, the rain-slicked streets seemed to pull me in her direction, though I had no real reason to approach again. And yet, something about her presence had rooted itself in me, a quiet insistence that I couldn't ignore. I began to linger outside her garden gate, careful not to intrude, watching as she moved through her world with effortless grace. She tended to her flowers, the sunlight catching the gentle highlights in her hair, or paused by the window, a book held loosely in her hands. There was a rhythm to her movements, a subtle poetry that drew my eyes and held my attention. At first, our encounters were brief. She would notice me, and I would nod politely, a flicker of recognition passing between us. But gradually, our interactions deepened, not with words, but with gestures. She began leaving little signs of acknowledgement, a hand lightly resting on the gate when she opened it, a fleeting glance that held longer than politeness required. I felt the quiet thrill of connection in these small, intimate moments, as if the universe had allowed us brief proximity without breaking the protective spell that her household demanded. The daughter's nanny was always there, of course, but I began to notice subtle cracks in her vigilance. A momentary distraction, a soft smile, the way she would glance away at precisely the wrong, or right, time. It was in these brief windows that the widow and I could communicate silently. A nod, a quick smile, a heartbeat of recognition that belonged entirely to us. There was a strange intimacy in these stolen moments, a sense of knowing each other's rhythms without speaking. I began to understand her subtle cues, the way her hand lingered on the gate, the tilt of her head when she paused to observe me, the almost imperceptible softening of her shoulders when our eyes met. Each detail became a language of longing, delicate yet electric. The world outside her windows, sunlight glinting on leaves, the distant laughter of her daughter, the faint scent of roses in the air, seemed to exist just for these moments. Even standing at the edge of her garden, separated by wood and glass, I felt closer to her than I had to anyone in weeks. And in that distance, there was a quiet tension, a slow-building ache that made every encounter heavier with unspoken possibilities. I wanted to cross the threshold again, to hear the soft warmth of her voice in the kitchen, to feel the steady reassurance of her presence in the room. But the invisible boundary of her world remained firmly in place, a gentle reminder that meaningful connections often grow in patience and restraint. By the time I walked home each evening, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening in gold and silver from the fading light. My chest would tighten with longing, and yet a quiet satisfaction lingered. In those fleeting glimpses through windows, we had found a way to connect, to communicate, and to begin the delicate dance that would slowly pull us together, without words, without crossing forbidden lines, yet entirely, irresistibly intimate. A few days later, an unexpected message arrived, an invitation that made my chest tighten with anticipation. The widow needed help with a small household task, something simple, she insisted, but enough to bring me back into her space. I hesitated at the doorstep, heart pounding, aware that this was no longer just a casual encounter outside the gate. This time, I would step fully into her world. The door opened before I could knock, and there she was, framed in the warm glow of the hallway. Her eyes held that same gentle curiosity as before, but there was something else now, an almost imperceptible vulnerability, a quiet invitation that stirred something in me I hadn't expected. The nanny hovered nearby, but her attention was momentarily elsewhere, attending to the daughter who played in the next room. Inside, the house was a sanctuary of comfort and subtle elegance. The scent of fresh flowers mingled with the faint aroma of baked bread, and the soft hum of a record spinning in the background created a delicate intimacy. I followed her to the living room, where a small pile of books and papers needed sorting. It was mundane work, but the closeness made every movement charged with unspoken tension. As we worked side by side, our hands occasionally brushed, light, almost accidental touches that sent a quiet thrill up my arm. One moment, I reached for a book at the same time she did. Our fingers lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. I felt the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of her sleeve, the softness of her hand moving beside mine. We exchanged a glance, silent acknowledgement, a spark of connection that needed no words. The widow spoke softly, asking questions about my life, my work, my small daily routines. Her tone was gentle, interested, and utterly sincere. I found myself revealing details I wouldn't normally share with a stranger. The little disappointments, the fleeting joys, the quiet dreams I had tucked away. There was trust here, a space carved out for honesty and vulnerability, and I sensed she felt it too. Even as we spoke, the nanny remained a subtle presence, close enough to remind us that boundaries existed, distant enough to allow our connection to breathe. Each glance, each touch, each soft word became a silent dance, a careful negotiation of intimacy that respected the limits of her home while building the quiet electricity between us. At one point, I reached to adjust a fallen book from the coffee table. She leaned closer to help, and our shoulders brushed. For a second, the world outside the room faded. The sound of the daughter's laughter, the distant hum of traffic, the ticking clock, all gone. There was only this small, shared space, the warmth of her presence, the subtle pull of proximity that made my chest tighten in the most unexpected way. By the time I left that evening, the rain had returned, tapping gently on the windows. Yet I didn't mind. Inside the house, a slow and quiet connection had begun to bloom, fragile but undeniable. And though nothing had been declared, nothing had been crossed, I knew with absolute certainty. The pull between us had deepened, and the boundaries of her world were slowly, but inexorably, starting to bend. A few evenings later, I found myself standing at the widow's gate again, though this time there was no rain to soften the air. The evening sky was a pale lavender, the kind that made everything feel suspended between day and night, quiet and possibility. She invited me into the garden, where a low bench rested beneath a blooming jasmine vine. The daughter's laughter echoed from inside the house, a distant reminder of the life unfolding around us, while the nanny lingered in the shadows, giving us space but remaining nearby enough to keep the balance. We sat side by side, the bench barely wide enough to separate us completely. She spoke softly about her life, about the grief she still carried for her late husband, and about the ways in which she tried to protect her daughter from the weight of it all. Her voice held no bitterness, only a quiet, aching honesty that made my chest tighten. I realized then how much she carried, not just in sorrow, but in love, responsibility, and resilience. I listened, careful not to interrupt, letting her words fill the space between us. When she paused, her gaze lingered on the delicate blooms above our heads, then shifted to me, and I felt the weight of her eyes as if they could read the corners of my heart. I wanted to reach for her hand, but hesitated, uncertain, respectful, aware of both her world and the invisible boundary marked by the nanny. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, our hands met. Her palm was cool at first, then gradually warmed against mine, and I felt the subtle pulse of life beneath her skin. She didn't pull away, but neither did she squeeze. Our touch was a quiet, deliberate confession, a language of vulnerability spoken without words. For a moment, The garden seemed to exist only for us. The faint rustle of leaves, the soft scent of jasmine, the distant hum of life inside the house, all faded to background noise. I found myself speaking softly, almost involuntarily, about the small disappointments in my life, the moments I'd felt unseen or misunderstood. And she listened, her head tilting slightly, her hand remaining over mine, offering reassurance without words. In her presence, I felt both safe and exposed, understood and challenged, as though she saw the best and the most uncertain parts of me simultaneously. There was a tension in the air, not urgent or desperate, but alive with possibility. A slow, steady pull, like a tide that had begun quietly but would not be denied. When she finally spoke again, it was with a soft smile, eyes glistening in the fading light. "You understand more than you realize," she said, and in that simple statement, I felt an entire world of connection unfold. We remained there for a while, side by side, hands touching, hearts quiet but fully aware. The nanny occasionally glanced our way from the doorway, but she never intruded. The moment was fragile, delicate, and entirely ours. In that silence, in the shared vulnerability, I understood something essential. That intimacy was not about grand gestures or declarations. It was about presence, trust, and the courage to meet someone in the quietest parts of themselves. By the time I left that night, the stars had begun to appear, soft pinpricks of light in the vast sky. I walked home with a quiet thrill in my chest, knowing that our connection had deepened in ways words could barely capture. And though the world outside awaited, inside the garden, in that brief, fragile moment, something profound had begun. The next afternoon, I returned to the house with a quiet sense of anticipation, but the atmosphere had shifted. The nanny was waiting in the hallway, her posture deliberate, her eyes assessing me with a mixture of curiosity and caution. There was no smile this time, only the calm assertion of someone determined to protect what she valued most. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm, and I nodded. She led me into the sunlit hallway, where the warm glow of the room contrasted sharply with the tension in the air. There was a quiet gravity in her presence, an authority earned from years of responsibility, and I realized instantly that this conversation would determine whether I was allowed closer or kept at a polite distance. She began cautiously, expressing her concern for the daughter's well-being and her responsibility to shield the widow from disappointment or harm. "She's careful with her heart," the nanny said, "and she has reasons to be." Her gaze was steady, challenging, and I understood that my every word, every gesture, would be weighed with precision. I spoke honestly, with as much sincerity as I could summon. I told her why I came, what drew me to the widow, not the fascination of beauty or novelty, but the quiet integrity, the depth of her heart, the way she carried grief with grace. I described how I felt in her presence, the sense of calm and warmth, the pull that was gentle but persistent. I didn't exaggerate or plead. I simply offered the truth as clearly as I could. She listened, arms still lightly crossed, head tilted in that subtle, evaluative way, but I could see cracks forming in her composure. A brief nod here, a softening around the eyes there. She asked questions, probing gently, testing my intentions and my capacity for patience and understanding. I answered with honesty, aware that sincerity was my only leverage. At one point, she stepped closer, reducing the space between us without aggression. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, and I could hear the quiet heartbeat of my own resolve. She paused, and for a moment, our eyes met in silence. In that instant, there was no doubt that she was weighing not only my words but the subtle cues of my presence, my posture, the steadiness of my gaze, the respect I showed for boundaries. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only minutes, her expression softened completely. She gave a small, approving nod and allowed a faint smile to play at her lips. "I think she would be safe with you," she said quietly. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was profound. It was permission, acceptance, and a cautious blessing rolled into one. I exhaled, feeling a wave of relief, gratitude, and even a quiet joy. In that hallway, with the sunlight catching dust motes and the soft hum of the house around us, I realized that trust had been earned, not demanded, not assumed, but carefully, deliberately granted. When the widow appeared moments later, smiling warmly from the doorway, I felt the pull between us intensify. Not urgent, not reckless, but quietly electric. The obstacle that had loomed for so long had been transformed into affirmation. And in that fragile, human moment, I understood that slow-burn connection is built not on shortcuts or grand declarations, but on patience, honesty, and the courage to be fully seen. The afternoon sunlight spilled through the tall windows, pooling in golden rectangles across the polished wooden floor. The house felt alive yet peaceful, as if it had been waiting for this moment, a quiet, deliberate embrace of connection that had been building for weeks. I stepped inside, and for the first time, there was no tension, no hesitancy. The nanny was there, yes, but her guarded stance had softened entirely, replaced with an approving calm that welcomed my presence. The widow appeared in the kitchen doorway, smiling in a way that made the world feel just a little warmer. Her daughter played nearby, laughter spilling like sunlight across the room, and I realized how natural it felt to be part of this scene. It wasn't about romance alone. It was about becoming part of a family, quietly, respectfully, and with genuine affection. We gathered around the small dining table for tea. The scent of freshly baked scones mingled with the faint aroma of jasmine from the garden, and the clink of porcelain cups created a gentle rhythm, a soundtrack for intimacy and warmth. The widow poured tea, her hand brushing mine briefly as she handed me a cup, and I felt the familiar pull, the heartbeat of connection that had grown steadily over weeks of stolen glances and quiet moments. The daughter leaned against my shoulder, soft and trusting, and I felt the odd, tender thrill of being accepted, not just by her mother, but by the life they shared. The widow's eyes met mine, lingering just long enough for me to catch the subtle smile in them, a wordless acknowledgement of what had grown between us. The nanny's glance, approving yet careful, confirmed what words could not, that I was now part of this delicate, intimate world. We spoke quietly, sharing small anecdotes, laughter threading through the pauses. There was no urgency, no rush to define what had happened between the widow and me. Just the simple, profound satisfaction of being present, of feeling warmth in proximity, of trust fully granted. Our hands occasionally brushed. Her fingers lingered a moment on mine when reaching for the teapot. Each contact was deliberate, charged with a gentle tension that had been building since our first encounter at the gate. As the afternoon faded into early evening, the lights softened, casting a warm glow over the room. I realized that every boundary, every challenge, had led to this, the quiet culmination of slow-burn patience and shared vulnerability. The nanny, once a gentle barrier, had become part of the rhythm, part of the safety that allowed connection to flourish. Finally, as I rose to leave, the widow's hand rested lightly over mine. Her touch was tender, grounding, and I felt the steady pulse of her presence beneath my fingers. A quiet, mutual understanding passed between us, affection, trust, and something more, something that needed no words to define it. The daughter waved from her perch by the table, and the nanny gave a small, satisfied smile. In that simple, perfect tableau, I felt the full weight of what had grown between us, a connection that was warm, respectful, and enduring. Walking home, the sun dipping below the horizon, I carried with me the certainty that slow burn, carefully nurtured love could bloom in the quietest of spaces, and that sometimes, the most profound intimacy is built not on grand gestures, but on presence, patience, and shared humanity.